session. So Surajit, you want to go first?
Thanks, Rahul. Hi, this is Shurojit out here. I run the channels for FOSSCOUT for India and the SAARC countries. Of course, Rahul works with me as well as with the Southeast Asia team. So that's all from my side. Thanks, Rahul.
No worries. Lau, you on the call, mate?
Yep. Hi guys. So my name is Lau. I'm the Channel SE for Asia. I'm Rahul's counterpart, managing all the partners for Asia. Yeah, so I hope that everyone can learn something out of today's Tech Tuesday session. Right.
Yep. Thank you. And I have got the first request to record the session. I'm more than happy to do that. And we will upload this on to our partner portal if it goes through our legal. Just give me a second and I'm going to start the recording. All right. I think it is recording now. Can you guys see my screen? From the panelist, I'm sure the attendees can't answer my question, but
yes.
Okay, perfect. Let's kick off then. So today's session, as I said, is about the radius, and if I can navigate, something is wrong and I can't navigate. There you go. So what is radius? Right, that's the first thing. If you know about radius, please bear with me. Not everyone is on the same page as far as the radius functionality or 802.1x is concerned. So I want to take you guys through some understanding of what radius is, what 802.1x is. We'll go through some basic terminologies and the process flows, and then we will move towards how we do it in the FOSSCOUT. So if you know about these, please feel, just stay with me, and then we'll move on to the next session. It's a IEEE RFC standard 2865, which defines that it's a client and a server model that allows the network access server, or a NAS or a NAD, depending on what you want to call it, that operates as a client for Radius. Now, Radius servers are responsible. Radius server itself is responsible for receiving user or a client connection request that is from your endpoints, then authenticating that user or an endpoint, depending on how you're configuring it, and returning all the configurational information necessary for that client to communicate or to join the network. That's what the Radius standard as far as the IEEE is concerned. Now, Radius server can also act as a proxy client to other Radius servers or other kind of authentication servers. So it doesn't necessarily means that the Radius server has to do the authentication. It can be a proxy which passes the information to another Radius server to get the endpoint or the device authenticated. Now that's different from what we.
Rahul, I think you need to stop. I think you're sharing both screen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so you have to choose one of the screen. Yep, your screen 2.
Is it better now?
Nope, not yet.
All right, let me just stop sharing completely and then start again.
Yep, this looks good.
Okay, perfect. Sorry for that. Okay. All right. So what is 802.1x? We've spoken about Radius, but what is 802.1x? It is an IEEE standard for network access control, or a port-based network access control. It provides an authentication mechanism to the users or the devices that are trying to connect or trying to access the LAN or the wireless LAN network. It uses EAP, which stands for Extensible Authentication Protocol, that passes the authentication information between the supplicant and the authentication server. Now, there are multiple types of EAP authentication, and I'm not going to go through each one of them, but just for the reference, we've got EAP TLS, EAP TLS, TTLS, we've got PEAP, FAST, LEAP, and I'm sure you guys are aware of the differences that we have between each one of them. So I'm not going to go through those details as part of this session. Let's look at some of the terminologies before we move forward. So make sure that all of the people who are on the call understands about 802.1x and the terminologies that we're talking about. So as per IEEE 802.1x standards, EAP-OL or EAP over LAN is a layer 2 protocol for transporting EAP packets, right? The EAP packets are between the supplicant and the authenticator directly over the LAN using the MAC services for both wired as well as wireless. So what it means is that it's using layer 2 protocols to communicate. If you look at the Radius, on the other hand, Radius is a transport protocol used by EAP and works on layer 3, right? It is also used for authorization attributes, value paired after initial authentication and authorization. So if you remember, or if you have worked on Radius before, you might have heard a terminology called COA, which sends the AV pairs to change the authorization of the endpoint that is connected onto the network. Some of the other terminologies that we have, which is supplicant, which is essentially an end device or end user or endpoint, depending on what you want to call it. It could be your laptop, it could be your iPad, iPods, whatever kind of devices that is trying to connect to a network. Then what we have is a NAS or a NAD, depending on what you want to call it. Some people call it NAD, some people calls it NAS, which stands for network access device or a server, essentially your switches, your access points, your WLCs. All those devices are your NADs or NAS, right? And then you have your Radius server. In our case, it's Forescout. Let's look at some of the other terminologies. EAP I've already mentioned, which is Extensible Authentication Protocol. It's essentially a wrapper or a transport mechanism for encapsulating the authentication methods that we have. And I've already shown you some of the authentication methods that we have. Just a recap on which the common ones that we use, which is PEEP, which is one of the EAP methods, which is using username and password for authentication. I'm sure that, you know, if you have been in the industry or you have even started with the industry, you might have seen entering your username and password credentials to connect to the network. That is essentially a PEEP method that you use. The other one that you have is EAP TLS, which TLS stands for, of course, Transport Layer Security. It uses client certificates for authentication. So instead of using username and password, there is a certificate that is installed, whether it's your user certificate or your machine certificate, that sits on the endpoint, and that is being used to authenticate the endpoint. COA, as I mentioned earlier, change of authorization. It's an extension to the Radius to enable it to send authorization AVPs or AV pairs, as they call it, after the initial authentication has been completed, okay? Now, let's just go with the flow. The first thing that we need to have this 802.1x working is an end user or a supplicant or an endpoint and device which wants to connect to a network. Sorry. When you're talking about an endpoint, it will connect to your NAD device or your switching infrastructure, your wireless infrastructure, right? So that's the second thing that you need in your environment, which is your NAT or an authenticator. And the third thing that you need is your authentication server or Radius. In this case, we have Forescout performing the Radius functionality. Now, it's not necessary that Forescout is used as an authenticator or a Radius, sorry, as an authentication server or Radius. It could be in Radius proxy as well, just in case if you have an environment where the customer's already having the Radius server that they are using, but they still want to utilize some of the functionalities that we have within Forescout. So you can use Forescout as a Radius proxy. Now, if you go through the flow of how this communication starts, if during the boot up, if the supplicant does not receive an EAP request or identity message from the authenticator that you need to send the authentication, the supplicant initiates the authentication by sending an EAP over LAN start frame, right? So it will say that I want to connect to the network. Here is my EAP over LAN communication frame that I need to start, which then prompts the router to request the supplicant's identity, right? So the authenticator will then send back information or request an information from the supplicant. Once this EAP is negotiated, the authenticator or the supplicant is going to send the EAP request message to the EAP response message to the authenticator that it should proceed with the authentication, right? The authenticator, in this case, your NAS device or your switch or your wireless controllers or access point, depending on whatever you have, acts as a pass-through and encapsulates that EAP response with the EAP message attribute and sends that to the authentication server or Radius server within the Radius access request, right? On the other hand, our authentication server or Radius or Forescout in this case will send a response message or a challenge containing the EAP message attribute back to the authenticator. If the Radius server does not support that particular EAP method, it will send an access reject message. If it does, then it will send an access challenge message. Now, authenticator, after receiving this particular challenge, will then further forward that to the supplicant to say, provide your authentication information, whether it's your PEEP or your username password or your certificates. And the supplicant will respond back using the EAP response authentication information, which the authenticator will then forward it back to the Radius server. The Radius server on the back end will communicate with your AD, with your whatever kind of directory services that you're using, and validate that information to make sure that the user or the supplicant that is connecting is an authorized supplicant. Once confirmed, Radius access will be accepted, and that information will be sent back to the supplicant. Once that is accepted by the supplicant, the port is authorized by the NAS or by the authenticator to allow this supplicant to communicate or connect to that particular switch port or the wireless SSID. Now, in certain cases, if the port state changes to unauthorized, that would be because of the port going up or down, or in case of wireless SSID going down or wireless access point not available. Or on the other hand, if the supplicant is disconnecting itself from the network, it will send an EAP over LAN logoff message. Once it does send that information to the NAS authenticator, the port will be marked as unauthorized. So which means that if a new supplicant is going to connect, it is going to go through the same process again before the port becomes authorized. Now, that's the standard functionality or the standard flow of 802.1x or a Radius server that you might have in your environment. Now, let's look at how 802.1x works with Forescout, right? What are the prerequisites or what are the requirements to do that? The first requirement is, of course, to have the latest version of Forescout, which in our case is 8.2. That doesn't mean that we do not have 8.1. All I'm saying is I'm talking about the latest version that we have. The next thing that we need is a network module, which includes your switch plugin or wireless plugin, depending on whether you're implementing your 802.1x for the wired infrastructure or for your wireless infrastructure. Then what you need is your authentication module, which is within Forescout is your user directory plugin that you need for authentication and authorization against your Active Directory or the external Radius that you might have. So if you're using Forescout as a Radius proxy, you might want to configure the external Radius in the user directory plugin so that Forescout can perform the authentication or send the authentication request to that Radius server that you have, external Radius server that you might have. And the last thing that we need is, of course, the licensing. So if you are using a flex licensing model, ensure that you have a valid Forescout iControl license because all the Radius functionalities fall within the control license of Forescout. Let's look at the readiness, right? How do you make sure that the Forescout is configured correctly? What are the plugins that needs to be configured? What are the things that we need to look into it? We check the requirements as far as Forescout is concerned, but how do we make sure that we are ready to start the 802.1x or Radius on our network through Forescout? So when defining or provisioning the 802.1x, the first thing that you need if you're going with the TLS is your certificates that you need on the FOSSCOUT. Now, there are two types of certificates that are defined as part of the requirements or readiness for FOSSCOUT. The first one that we have is the system certificates. It is required that a valid radius server certificate be available for validation of the external network endpoints. The other one is your trusted certificates. This is the trusted chain that are used by Radius plugin to authenticate the external endpoints. So it's the trust chain that you implement, whether it's your root chain or your sub certificate or sub chain certificate, you need to implement those. The other thing that you need is your network device or making sure that your network device is configured correctly. FOSSCOUT provides you with a template or a policy template that you can deploy within your environment to check the readiness of your switches or ports. All right, so if you can see on the screen, we have highlighted the template, which is for the switch, and then underneath that, you have a switch port readiness policy as well. That will help you understand what are the missing configurations within your NAS or authenticator environment, whether it's your switches or switch ports. Now, if you have done 802.1x before, you need to understand that there is prerequisites to configure the switch and the switch ports to enable it to be an authenticator or participate in 802.1x. So this policy will allow you to identify any missing configuration or any device that is not correctly configured to be an authenticator. Along with that, we also configure the switch in the wireless device plugin or wireless plugin with the Radius secret, which is allowing the Radius server as well as your authenticator, in this case, switch or a wireless device, to communicate using that secret to make sure that they are part of this 802.1x deployment that you are performing. We also have some of the policies, sorry, I should have shown that before. We also have a policy for checking the endpoint readiness. So if you are, if you have a supplicant configured on the endpoints and if you want to make sure that they are configured correctly, you can configure, and this is for wired, sorry, the wired Windows endpoint readiness, which will allow you to verify that the endpoint supplicant is configured correctly for participating in 802.1x, which is what I'm showing here. Now, if I know you guys are sending me questions about certain things that you see in your environment. As I said, I'll try to answer your questions, but if I can't, and if it's more specific to the issues that you see in your environment, please send us an email or please get in touch with myself or Lau and we will be able to help you out. I will be talking about general questions about 802.1x or Radius plugin within our environment with our panelists. But more specific things that you have about your environment or the deployments that you've done, please feel free to reach out to us after this session. And the last one, sorry, I shouldn't say last one. Of course, there's other stuff that you need to configure, but one of the key readiness that we need to check is user directory. Now, user directory plugin, if you guys have done deployment FOSSCOUT, you will know that user directory plugin helps you communicate with your AD infrastructure. In case if you're not using it for Radius or 802.1x, we utilize the user directory plugin to do a reverse LDAP lookup with the username to provide us with information about the user that we see on the managed endpoints, their email addresses, their phone numbers, their locations, etc. Now let's look at the Radius plugin itself, right? What are the things that we need to look into the Radius plugin? The first thing that we see when you look at the Radius plugin is your authentication source. Now, the sequence, and I'm going to show it to you in the lab environment as well, is that the sequence is that first you configure your user directory, the communication that you have with your AD infrastructure, and then you call that AD into your Radius plugin as an authentication source. Now, if you're using Radius or if you're using FOSSCOUT as a Radius proxy, you may wish to call your radius or the actual radius who's going to do the authentication as part of your authentication source. The next one is your pre-admission authorization. So I'm just going through the tabs that we have within the Radius plugin. The pre-admission authorizations are set of priority rules that you set or define within the Radius server to authorize the authenticated endpoints. And I want to highlight the word authenticated, right? So your authorization rules fall after once the user is successfully authenticated. If the user is not successfully authenticated, then you will not have that endpoint going through the pre-admission authorization rules. So something that you need to be careful of when you are going through your configuration or troubleshooting. The other ones, the radius settings. So these are some of the basic settings that we have. On the first option that you see is your radius authentication and accounting port numbers. By default, it's 1812 and 1813. The next one is your LDAP port, which is where Counteract or Forescout will utilize that port to communicate through the AD. So you have multiple options in there, like for example, global catalog or global catalog over TLS. So the port numbers differ in each one of them. You can use the standard LDAP calls, or you can have an LDAP over TLS, which uses a different port. So depending on how your AD configuration is, how your AD is configured and how you communicate with your AD, you might want to select one of those options. The other one is the OCSP, which stands for Online Certificate Status Protocol. That is an internet protocol used for obtaining the revocation status for the X509 digital certificates. And the last one is your CRL, which is essentially for certificate revocation list. So in case if you have a client which has got an a certificate that was revoked or banned from connecting to the network, Forescout will verify that the certificate, if you're using IPTLS, of course, that the certificate that was presented by the supplicant is actually valid and is allowed to communicate on the network. And the last one that we talk about is the MAB, or a MAC address bypass. Now, MAC address bypass essentially is a repository of the MAC addresses of the endpoint that do not participate in 802.1x. Typical use cases would be your VoIP phones or your IoT devices, your printers, which may or may not be able to communicate, or which may or may not be able to have certificates or a supplicant configured to participate in 802.1x authentication. In those cases, what you do is you define a MAC address, and if the MAC address matches, Forescout will then allow the endpoint to connect. And that is a standard functionality across any Radius service that you see in the different vendors that we have. Now, personally, and this is purely my personal preference, I do not prefer to use MAB. Of course, there are some instances where you don't have a choice, but as I said, personally, I don't think MAB is an industry or a enterprise grade security solution as such. Please bear with me. I'm going to look at your questions. I know I'm looking at some of them right now as I'm going through the session, but let me finish the session first, and we'll go through your questions later. So some of the attributes that are required by Forescout to execute 802.1x in a proper manner, or I should say, make it work. And some of those attributes are username, right? It may contain domain name depending on how you configured it, but it is important for us to know the username, right? Then the next is the call station ID. In case of wireless, this would include your SSID or access point MAC address, followed by the SSID. So I've given some example. Now the format may differ, and you have an option to change the format depending on what kind of access point you are using. Say for example, when I show you some of the snapshot of my lab environment, my call station ID doesn't have any kind of a differentiator between the MAC addresses, so it doesn't use column or a hyphen. It's just a MAC address followed by the SSID. Then what you have is your calling station ID, which is basically a MAC address of the host, right? For us to make changes or for us to inform of any changes to the access point or a switch, we need to know which MAC address are we going to target, right? So we need to know that MAC address of the host. And then you have the NAS IP address, which is essentially the IP address of a switch or a wireless controller or an access point, depending on where you're coming from, so that we can revert back the changes to that particular to that particular NAS, whether it's your switch or your wireless LAN controller or access point. And this is where this is very useful when you are looking at sending COAs or change of authorization request or changing VLANs or something like that. It is important to have that information. If you don't see this information, some of the functionalities or some of the controls may not work. And the next one that we have, or the last one that we have, is your NAS port type, which essentially means that is it a wired 802.1x communication or is it a wireless 802.1x communication? So just before the session, what I did was I connected my lab environment, ran some dumps to understand and show you how we retrieve that information in a raw format, which is then being ingested into the Radius plugin. So as you can see, I'm just running a TCP dump on port 1812, which is what we use for our authentication and authorization. And when I'm running that TCP dump, I can see that by connecting my supplicant or the endpoint, I can see the information that has been shared by the authenticator using that supplicant information and forward it to the Radius server. In case of that snapshot, you see Forescout acting as a Radius server. So the first thing that we see is the domain name /user. So as you can see, this is my personal lab. So it says FS Lab with my username. And then you see your NAS IP address. In this case, my IP address, which is .1.2, is an Aruba access point, which is an IAP access point, so it doesn't have a wireless LAN controller. But that is what I'm using for the testing purpose. The next that you see is your port type. As I said, this is a Aruba wireless access point, so you can see it is mentioning wireless. If it was a wired communication, it would say wired with IEEE 802. Whatever it is. The other one is your calling station ID, which is essentially your MAC address of the host, right? So there's a difference between a calling station ID and a called station ID. So calling station ID is the MAC address of the endpoint that is connecting or the host that is connecting. And the next one is your called station ID followed by the SSID that I'm using to communicate. So in this case, the MAC address that you see is the MAC address of my Aruba access point, followed or differentiated by a colon with my SSID that I'm using to communicate. Now, that is when someone's trying to communicate or when someone's trying to authenticate for the first time. This is what you will see, right? These are the information that we need as part of the Radius to function properly or to authenticate properly. But what happens when you send a COA or change of authorization to say, a device is non-compliant and you want to change a VLAN or something like that? In those cases, or you want to use the pre-authorization policies. In those cases, the things change, right? We're sending that information, whatever we're collecting, we're sending it back in some one or the other way. So if I show you the snapshot of what happens when we're sending a COA, we're sending, of course, a COA request, as you can see here. Along with that, we have got the session ID, which is, of course, used between the communication that we're having with the Radius server. We are also sending the station ID. We are also sending what changes we are sending, right? I should have highlighted the bottom line as well, but as you can see, I am trying to change the VLAN or a group ID to 99. And the attribute that I'm sending is VLAN. So I'm trying to move this endpoint to a separate VLAN or to a new VLAN. In my case, it's a quarantine VLAN. So I'm sending it to a quarantine VLAN. We also see the acknowledgement that is received by the COA. So you send the request, you receive the acknowledgement that things have been performed. It's working perfectly fine. And as you can see that I'm receiving an acknowledgement by my the Aruba access point that I've got. And the port type or the communication is wireless, right? Now let's just look at the best practice quickly. I'm just looking at the time and we need some time to go through the lab. So I'm just going to run through this quickly. Some of the terminologies or things that I wanted to talk about is your managing appliances versus your authenticating appliance. Managing appliance is essentially assigned an IP address scope or a segment of the endpoints that it's going to manage. And then you have authenticating appliance, which is essentially Forescout appliance or an EM or a VM, sorry, that is responsible solely for authenticating the Radius requests that are coming in. Now, I'm not saying that this is how it should be. The idea is that you want to separate them. If something goes wrong with your Radius, your Radius chassis or your Forescout, you do not want to have an impact on the rest of the performance or rest of the functionalities that Forescout provides, right? The other thing is, if you are having an authenticated appliance, they are usually called a focal appliance, and the focal appliances differ, right? Some of the focal appliances are switch focal appliance, which is responsible for managing number of switches that you have in your environment. You may have a focal appliance or a managing appliance, you are looking at the endpoints, and you can also have a focal appliance for Radius. In case of a focal appliance for Radius, you may think about having a failover clustering, or you may think about having a HA pair, depending on how you want to have your architecture done. It is a best practice if you are deploying a Radius functionality to separate your managing versus your focal appliance, because that way one doesn't affect the other if something goes wrong. It also helps you have a redundancy at a level where focal appliance, if one of the focal appliance dies, the other one is still working and authenticating the user. It's usually a balance between business continuity versus security. So I'm sure you guys are a best judge of identifying what needs in your environment. But if you need any help, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to help you out in that. Right, so I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but recently, about 2 weeks ago, there was a GA release for 8.2.1, and as part of that, we also introduced the new versions of plugins. Sorry, I paused for a minute because someone messaged and said, "Is there a problem with my audio?" You guys can hear me properly, right, Lau and Surjit?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. So sorry, whoever it is, it's on your side. Sorry, mine's working perfectly fine. So until this release, which is the new release, is Radius plugin 4.5.1. The Radius plugin could not use the COA message with the network devices of non-Cisco vendors, right, including Arista and Juniper Mist. So for the endpoints that are managed through these devices, COA required disconnection of the existing session and reauthorization. With this new release, the Radius plugin supports COA via device of all vendors. Right? The plugin can be used for a role-based endpoint management, including MAB or MAC address bypass, also while maintaining the session stability and the connectivity. So some of the options that you will see if you implement this new plugin, you will see that there is a new option which says COA here. It can be used as part of the pre-authorization rule, also as part of your policy management with the Radius authorization actions that you might want to take. Complementary to this new option with the plugin, we have also got an option with the switch plugin and the wireless plugin that lets you configure the per vendor default for the session ID and other information that is used in a COA message. So the switch plugin that would give you this option is version 8.1.4.2. If you need further information, if you can't remember that version, feel free to send us an email and we will reply back. Or you can read the release notes as well, right? Now, rather than wasting more time, let's look at the lab so that we can, I can show you how the plugins are configured, how it works. So while I am talking, I'm just going to stop my sharing and I am going to open my Forescout environment. And let me just give you a brief information about what my lab looks like. So I've got 2 VMs that are running, and I've got a Windows machine or a Windows laptop that I'm using to connect. Let me first share my screen so that I can show you. All right, Lau, let me know if I'm sharing the correct screen and you can see what's happening.
Yep, you are.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, first of all, disconnect this wireless that I was testing. So this is the desktop that I'm going to work with. I'm going to delete that from here. I just want to make sure that you guys see what's happening. Now, the first thing that you need to do, if you remember when I was going through the session, is that you need to configure your user directory. And to do that, you just need to go into the options. And within the options, you go into the user directory. And in this case, I've configured my Active Directory server here as my authenticating mechanism, which is Active Directory. There's not much in the configuration. I'm sure everyone who have done the FSCA course will know. I'm entering the server name, and it should match the exact server name that you have in your environment. It is essential for Radius to have the matching server name for the authentication process to work. So make sure you don't write AD1 or primary AD, write the exact name of the server. In the settings, since I'm not using TLS, it's on the standard protocol, I'm using the IP address. You can use the DNS detection or FTDN, but inherent problem is that if the DNS server is down, you won't be able to resolve that information. So there it is. That's my domain that I've got. The account that I've created for the authentication, I'm just using administrator. As I said, this is my lab environment. I didn't bother to create separate users for them. And some test information that I have, right? Once I configure the user directory, I will test it. Once the test is successful, you will see that when I click on the user details, my account that I have created on this user directory is able to fetch the information about that particular user that I've configured in the test environment. Now, once that is done, I'll jump onto my Radius plugin, and I'm not going through the configuration that I've done on my authenticator or your switch or your access point. I'm just talking about the configuration that we need to do on our Forescout environment. Once I click on the Radius, let me just remove this. And let's just reconfigure it from the scratch so that you guys can see what's happening. All right, so I'm going to add my authentication server in case of this is my user directory. So when I click on add, I can see my AD server that I've configured through the user directory. All I need to do is click OK. So if you have multiple AD directories or servers or Radius servers, you will have the list over here, and you can select the one that you want to configure. In this case, I have only one, so I'm selecting the one that I have. Along with that, I'm going to configure the server or the Radius plugin to test if the communication is working fine or not. So I will just configure the username and password of one of the users or the test users to make sure that the communication is working fine and the authentication is being performed. So once I apply, sorry for this, I've got multiple screens, so it just jumps on the main screen. As you can see, this one's done. and saved. You need to make sure that you join the domain. When you join the domain, it will allow Forescout user or the user that you have created to authenticate on behalf of the Forescout using AD or on behalf of the supplicant. So in this case, I am going to use my credentials that I have created or the user that I have created. And then I'll press join. And it is going to ask me which devices do I want to join. It's a very bad practice to have your enterprise manager configured with your plugin. But in this case, as I said, it's just my lab environment. So I'm not bothered to play around with those things. Once it is done, you will see that each device, if you have a focal device, you can select the focal device. If you have a one device, you can select one of the devices and then configure this plugin on that. But you will see that the Radius plugin has successfully joined the domain, or the Counteract appliance has joined the domain. I can then press the apply just to be sure and make sure that everything is configured correctly. Press OK. And then just to validate that everything is working fine, I can press test. Once I do, you will see this option, press yes. This will go and check, validate that the information that we have entered. Oops, this is not a good sign. Let's test it again. Make sure everything was done correctly. Okay, perfect. That's better. It took a little bit of time to configure and push the configuration onto the Counteract appliance from my enterprise manager. So as you can see, the Counteract appliance joined correctly, and it was testing the authentication with the test credential. So if you remember, when I was configuring it, pressing this configuration button, I entered the username and password for one of the dummy accounts that I might have created on my AD infrastructure. This test will then use that credential to authenticate and make sure that the authentication is successful. If it is successful, that means that whenever a device is trying to communicate to the network and request or provides the username and password, it will then be authenticated by the Radius server. Once you do that, once you define your authentication sources, you can go into the pre-admission authorization. Now, depending on your requirements, in my lab environment, what I have is 3 different groups or LDAP groups that I want to verify. You can use different types of options that you have. So if I show you the pre-admission rules, you can define the criteria that you want to check or validate for that particular user. I can select the authentication type. I can select the called station ID or calling station ID, depending on the use case that we have. We can also validate the certificate issuer or subject. I can also have a restriction based on the day and time. So if you have a guest SSID where you are authenticating using some default credentials or something, and you want to have these attributes configured as well. I shouldn't say guest because it's a very bad example. Let's look at contractors, right? So you're not allowing your contractors to join on Saturday and Sunday. So you can define those patterns here to make sure that if they are contractors, they are not allowed to connect to the network. You can also look for the LDAP groups. So in this example, what I'm looking for is an LDAP group. So I've got multiple users that I've created in my AD infrastructure, and I'm checking if that user that is connecting is part of the administrator group. Then I want to assign that user to VLAN 1. So I'm sending a COA, or I'm sending the information back as part of my authorization to say, if you are connecting using a particular credential, if you are authenticated successfully, I want to check if you belong to a particular LDAP group. If you do, then you should be part of this particular VLAN. If you don't, and if you belong to a BYOD group, then I want to move you to VLAN 5 and guest VLAN 10. If none of them matches, access denied. I don't know you. I don't want you to connect. Now, this is on top of the authentication, right? This is once the user has been authenticated. That's when this happens. It goes sequentially, right? Same as policies. So it starts from the top, goes bottom and bottom down. You can move up and down depending on your requirements. Once you do that, once you configure the Radius plugin, we have a standard policy sets. You can configure those policies using templates. So if you go into the policy template, oops, and type in 802.1x, and you will see all those policies. The ones that I'm going to show you is the authorization source, endpoint authorization, and troubleshoot the rejected authentication. I've already pre-configured those. So if I go here, I'll show you all these three that I have. Now, once I connect, and I've already got some devices that I was testing before. I'm just going to delete that and make sure that we don't have anything in here, right? So now, as you can see, we do not have any devices. Now I'm going to use my Windows device to connect to this particular SSID that I've configured and authenticate the username and password that I'm entering on my endpoint. Once I press connect, and this is now I've clicked on connect on that Windows endpoint. Once it reaches this Forescout and Forescout authenticates, you will see that this device is now been listed in the pre-admission rule because it matches one of the pre-admission rule, and that's why it is here. So if you look at the pre-admission rule, it says pre-admission rule 1, which, if you remember, was my administrator group. I was checking for LDAP group administrator. If you are, then I want to put you in VLAN 1. On the other hand, you will also see that the endpoint authorization has been accepted. If there was something wrong, you will see the endpoint coming down here, whether the authorization is denied or rejected, or they have provided invalid credentials, or they have issues with their certificates, etc. Right? Once the device has been authenticated, the device now performs as normal device that is connected to your network. So if I click on this, you will see the information that we have collected for the Radius authentication when you click on the authentication. So the Radius was accepted, right? That's the status of the 802.1x at the moment. You can see the domain that I'm connected to, the pre-authorization policy that was triggered. You can also see the authentication type, right? Because I'm using PEEP, which is username and password, and the appliance that was responsible for authenticating or using the Radius plugin to authenticate the endpoint. And the last authentication time and the NAS IP address. So if you remember the NAS IP address, it's the authenticator or your switch or your access point that is communicating. Now that's the basic configuration of 802.1x. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to, sorry, before I go there, I just realized something. If you see on the more, you will see the 802.1 external username that I've used. So I've used Rahul as my username with the domain, and that is where you see that information. Of course, we're not going to reveal the password, but you will see the username. So you can have a condition based on the username as well. Now, while I was working on troubleshooting for one of the partners, I prepared a policy to change the VLAN of a user if that user or a device is non-compliant. So I'm just going to showcase that policy to you as part of this session. So what I'm doing is I have written a policy which says if you are a compliant or if your device is compliant, then I want you to go into a production VLAN depending on which LDAP group you belong to. If you are a compliant device and if you belong to guest user, then you should be part of this VLAN, PYOD this. And if you're non-compliant, you fall into a quarantine VLAN. So as part of the compliance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable the antivirus. And once I do the disablement of the antivirus, this device becomes non-compliant. And as soon as that device becomes non-compliant, which I'm just going to turn off, this device will then go through the policy check of the compliance and non-compliance, depending on antivirus checks that we're doing. And once it does, it will come through this policy. If it is non-compliant, then it will fall into quarantine VLAN. Once it is compliant back, it will go back to the normal VLAN or their matching VLAN, depending on where they are. So let's look at the assessment policy. And we have one, which is this antivirus not installed. Oops, wrong one. Where's my device? I think that one was the one. All right, something wrong with the connectivity, I guess. All right, while it figures it out what's wrong with it, let's just, oh, there you go. It's now showing up. So when you look at the compliance policy, it's still retrieving the information about that device. So as you can see, this device, I've disabled the antivirus, and as soon as I do that, this device becomes non-compliant. And as part of the non-compliant, I am pushing that device to VLAN 99. So as you can see, the IP address has now changed to 99.2, which was 1.2 before. Now, once I enable or once I remediate the endpoint with the antivirus, it will go through the policy, check the validation of the LDAP group, check whether the device was compliant or not. And once it is, it will then push it back to the relevant VLAN where it belongs. In this case, it would be VLAN 1 or a production user, and the IP address would change back or would be assigned as part of the new VLAN. Now, while it does that, I'm going to enable the antivirus while it performs that action. Let's just open up, in the interest of time, let's just open up for the question and answers. So as you can see, it's now changing, and it will then change the IP address back to 1. All right, so I'm just going to stop sharing, and we are going to open up for Q&A. So the first question that we have is, how does 802.x certification configured for the mixed environment using self-signed and a local certificate? So we do not configure the self-signed certificate for pushing it onto the endpoint. The self-signed certificate is a temporary certificate that has been installed on the Forescout for the first time when you configure it. The idea is that you use your local certificate servers, and to do that, all you need to do is go into the options, and within the options, if you search for certificates, you will see the plugin that is responsible for managing it. So within the certificates, you will see trusted and system certificates. Awesome. The other one that we have is, can we generate a certificate on Forescout and be used for authentication, or should the customer need to provide a valid certificate? Customer needs to provide a valid certificate. The Forescout self-signed certificate is not used for pushing on and authenticating the end users. All these years, we have heard that 802.1x tedious and implementation may not be 100% successful and also takes longer time to implement. With Forescout, how does this challenge can be addressed? Now, the inherent issue that we see with the 802.1x is on the wired network, where you have to overhaul your switching infrastructure to participate in 802.1x. As far as wireless is concerned, that's the default protocol, right? You don't have much options as far as 802.1x is concerned. You have to use 802.1x. And as you have seen, as I've explained you, or as I've shown you, it's very easy to configure. And I'm not saying that it's going to be as easy as I showed you, but it is easy. It's relatively very easy to configure 802.1x using the plugins and the policies that we have predefined for you. What is the alternative for MAB for printers or IoT devices as it can't be authenticated? So there are two folds to this question. One is, yes, MAB is the default option when you are doing 802.1x. But then when you look at Forescout, Forescout also provides you non-802.1x functionalities, which is what we traditionally use. If you are, or if the customer is keen on deploying 802.1x, MAB is the only solution, but then Forescout allows you to validate that those printers or those IoT devices are actually those IoT devices. We do further classification, not just during the admission event. It's throughout the life cycle of that particular endpoint, right? So we continuously check. It's not just about the MAC address. It's more about the functionality of or the classification of those devices that we see. So To answer your question, even if you implement MAB with Forescout, and I'm not talking about other vendors, even if you implement MAB with Forescout, it still has functionality that you can use using the policies and classifications and assessments to identify those devices if they are actual corporate device or someone pretending to be using those devices. Your key in Wi-Fi user and administrator as login account are different privileges. Yes, Wi-Fi user is a normal user. And the reason I added that user is just to test the plugin and make sure that the plugin is able to authenticate a particular user when that username and password is presented as part of the 802.1x. An administrator account, or you can have a separate account created, but it needs to have an administrative right to at least authenticate on behalf of that user. So those two are different accounts as far as Radius plugin is concerned. Whether we have to configure 802.1x in all the switches or core switches is enough. Well, with 802.1x, unfortunately, on the wired, yes, you have to configure it on each and every switch because they are the one who are going to participate into 802.1x, right? So you need to configure that as part of it. If you're talking about access point, it's a different story, right? So on the wireless, it's your wireless LAN controller performing that authentication on behalf of the access point. Again, depending on what kind of access points you have in your environment. Okay. During the COA, user does not have to put the username and password every time VLAN is changed. That is the new enhancement that we have introduced as part of the new plugin that I mentioned, which was 4.x version on the Radius plugin. With Cisco, yes, we traditionally we were not required, or the user were not required to enter the username and password. But with the rest of the integration like Arista or Mojo, there was a constraint, but which has now been fixed as part of the new version that we have introduced. Okay, so that answers the questions that we have. There was one in the chat window, which I'm just going to look at it. In case, sorry, I have a case to run .1x with Cisco Wi-Fi. They are running flex mode when the PC is not compliant. Then apply back ACL, requires to put the ACL instead of removing the ACL block and machine compliant. Tested central mode, there is no such problem. Do you have any idea? You can answer me. As I said, William, sorry, I'm just going to name you. If you are talking about a particular issue, let's look at what's happening. Let's look at the policy flow and understand what's going on. Hopefully, the example that I've given you, where I'm changing the compliance requirements based on the production guest and all that stuff, maybe that might help you solve the issue. But then I would suggest let Lau or myself look at the deployment that you've done or the policy that you've configured and help you out with that issue. All right, so no more questions. And I think I've answered all the questions that you had. If you still have more questions, if you want to talk about something that you've done in your environment or something that you need help with as far as 802.1x is concerned, feel free to reach out to us. We are there to help you out. Once again, thank you for joining the Tech Tuesday. We will organize another Tech Tuesday with a different topic. Please join. Thank you very much for your time. If you have questions, reach out to us. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, guys.